Hello, I'm Nigel Steel. I've been one of the principal historians at the Imperial War Museums for many years now. I work both for the Imperial War Museum historic site HMS Belfast and also for the Churchill War Rooms, which is why I'm talking to you this evening. I'm hoping to answer some of your questions a bit later in the evening, but first we're going to watch a video which looks at the way in which Churchill's inspirational speeches of the Second World War helped to steady the nation and put Britain on a course for victory. So I'll speak to you again a little while after you've seen the video.
In the dark early days of the Second World War, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had few real weapons. Allied armies were in full retreat before a powerful German army, and invasion of Britain seemed very likely. Never one to shirk a challenge though, Churchill did battle with words instead.
But if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
The speeches he delivered at that time were some of the most powerful ever given in the English language. His words were defiant, heroic and human. They reached out to everyone in Britain, across Nazi-occupied Europe and throughout the world. As journalist Beverly Nichols wrote, he mobilised the English language and sent it into battle. But what made his speeches so special? And how did Churchill's words affect the outcome of the Second World War? Well, before we answer those questions, a reminder to subscribe to the Imperial War Museum's YouTube channel for more videos just like this every 2 weeks.
Churchill used language almost as a weapon, and he was well known for his barbs and for his witty remarks. He had a fantastic control of language, therefore not surprising that he was eventually awarded a Nobel Prize for Literature, and this reflects the power of his words and the fact that it had immense popular appeal.
When Churchill became Prime Minister in the summer of 1940, those skills would be tested to the full. Britain was losing the war, and things were only getting worse. In fact, on the very day that Churchill fulfilled his life's ambition, Germany had, that morning, began their blitzkrieg in France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. He also faced hostility from within his own party. Churchill had only become Prime Minister because the obvious candidate Lord Halifax had declined the position. Already a politician for 40 years, Churchill was considered by many people in Britain to be a warmonger, an adventurer and an opportunist with poor judgment. Crucially though, Churchill used his words to rally the nation in defiance of Hitler.
What Churchill managed to do was radiate confidence and belief, picking up an anxious and worried country and leading it forwards to the point where it had the belief they could win.
In 3 speeches from those dark days in 1940, we can see how Churchill attempted to bring the country together and encourage Britain to fight on. But what makes these speeches so powerful? Well, according to Nigel, there are 3 things that really make a Churchill speech.
The first is his very idiosyncratic choice of language. The second is the rhythm of the way he constructs the speech. And the third part was the way he delivered it, the way he performed it almost. And when you bring these things together, they create powerful, uplifting speeches which capture the mood of the nation and actually really genuinely inspire people.
First, let's look at his choice of language by focusing on Churchill's first speech as Prime Minister, Blood, Toil, Tears and Sweat. Given on the 13th of May, the speech aimed to define his premiership and show what Churchill was all about, while at the same time winning over his doubters in Parliament and around the country. Let's start off with that famous line. Churchill tells the House of Commons that he has nothing to offer as Prime Minister but blood, toil, tears and sweat. Now Churchill had a large vocabulary and drew very heavily on language from the Bible and Shakespeare.
Today it maybe looks a little old-fashioned, a little bit arch, but to people at the time, they would have understood it. And all of these unique phrases help to create the power and the meaning that we can still understand.
As with so many Churchill speeches, he loved using alliteration in phrases like struggle and suffering. He also loved repetition. He asked himself 2 questions: what is our policy and what is our aim, before repeating the answer to both: to wage war until victory.
This phraseology is what people take away. Churchill knew that this is what would capture the public imagination. It's the modern soundbite that he gives to people.
Next, let's look at Churchill's rhythm and focus on his "We shall fight on the beaches" speech. Now, this was delivered to the House of Commons on June 4th, after the evacuation from Dunkirk. Churchill had to strike a difficult tone, celebrating the success of the operation while preparing the nation for impending invasion. Churchill achieved his signature rhythmic delivery thanks to the way his speeches were laid out on the page. They were set out in up to 5-line indented paragraphs, similar to psalm form.
He had his typist put them in very short lines so that he knew exactly where to breathe, where to pause, where to give that dramatic moment. They're almost like spoken word poems in that he brings out the power of the individual words through the construction of the rhythm.
The most famous part of this speech uses anaphora to make its impact. The rhythm generated from the repetition of the phrase "we shall" builds up to the climax, the part he wants the audience to remember.
Repeating "we shall do this, we shall do that" until he gets to what he really wants to say, which is "we shall never surrender." And that is the key point he wants to get to, but he doesn't just say that, he brings people forward, he excites them, he inspires them, so that when he tells them that we as a nation shall never surrender, they believe him.
Finally, let's look at Churchill's delivery, which would only become a part of his speeches later in the summer.
Today we know about Churchill's speeches from the recordings that we have, but many of these were made after the war. The first of these speeches were largely read by the public in newspapers. Reading was as powerful as listening. But what happened when he moved on to the radio is that his voice became the instrument of reassurance and inspiration.
Of course, the best way to experience the power of Churchill's delivery is to listen to him directly, in this case delivering Their Finest Hour. This speech was made on June 18th, after France had sought an armistice with Germany. Morale was at a low point, but Churchill was trying to inspire the nation not to give in by placing these events within a larger historical context.
What General Viking has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization.
Churchill's delivery had to be faultless to get his ideas across, but public speaking wasn't something that had come naturally to him.
He had to work hard over the years to overcome a slight speech impediment. He couldn't say the letter S very well. He had a bit of a lisp, and he did this by control. By controlling the rhythm, by controlling the delivery, by stopping and speaking slowly and carefully.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit upland.
He was a great showman. What he wore, the way he spoke, the way he stood, it was all part of the show. We can see it in the way that he deliberately mispronounces words like Nazis.
A rightful case against the Nazi tyranny,
which is part of a kind of humorous defiance, as if to say, I'm not going to say your name properly. It was very important. This delivery matched the rhetoric that he'd put down.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Bring all these pieces together and you can see why Churchill's speeches have such power to this day, and how they helped bring belief back to the British people. Opinion polls, then in their infancy, showed that between July 1940 and May 1945, Churchill's approval rating never dipped below 78%.
He reached out to the people, and he not only made them believe that winning the war was possible, but he also convinced them that they were right to trust in him, because in the end he would lead them to victory.
And that's exactly what he did. On the 8th of May 1945, Churchill stood above a buoyant crowd in London, having given another signature speech.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
But despite the elation on that glorious day, It's Churchill's speeches from 1940 that we remember best.
That reassurance, that uplifting, that inspiration, all of which he does in the summer of 1940, is all reflected in the speeches that he gives. And I think that is why we keep coming back to them today, because it's tremendously instructive as to how a charismatic leader can take a shaken nation and turn it around.
Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to give us a like and put in a comment as well. Let us know what you want to see in future. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this, and check out the IWM Stories playlist as well if you want to learn more about Churchill. Some great videos in there.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that video and also my lockdown haircut. Churchill's speeches obviously were one of the finest achievements of the war for him. And so hopefully that might form part of the questions. And I turn it over to you now and look forward to answering the questions that you send in to me.
Thank you, Nigel. Our first question here has come from Alexander in Gulf Breeze in the United States. And he said, where did Churchill get most of his inspiration for writing his speeches?
Churchill went to India when he was a young man, when he was a soldier in a cavalry regiment, and there were long, languid days in India. He basically taught himself English literature, and from that he picked up many of the words and the phrases and the skills that he put into his speeches. So the inspiration for his speeches, I think, comes from a love of the English language. Shakespeare, the Bible, King James Bible, old authors like Gibbon and History of the Roman Empire, things like that are all brought into the way Winston Churchill wrote. And it formed, as I was saying in the video, the key part are things like the rhythm, but also what was very important in 1940-41 was a sense of historical continuity. He was not only talking about previous events, which really mattered to him as with a sense of Britain's history, but also he was trying to make the nation feel that what they were living through was a part of this long historical sweep that had gone back over hundreds of years. And he used his language to try and root the current experience in the past. And at that, he was very successful indeed.
Thank you. Claude in Corvallis says, did Churchill have a team or an assistant to help him with his speech writing? And would he practice or get approval from other members of the government before he delivered a speech?
Churchill wrote the speeches on his own. They came from within himself. But when he was a novice parliamentarian, in 1904, he had a very bad experience. He dried up on the floor of the House of Commons. And at that point, that was when he began to write his speeches out at length. And he had a very distinctive style of writing and presentation, which enabled him to keep the rhythm, to get the dramatic pauses. And he would often rehearse those. Certainly at the beginning, he would try out ringing phrases and building up to the crescendo of the argument on other people. But by the Second World War, it was mostly hard work and his skill as a wordsmith which enabled him to craft the speeches. And it's often said that around 30 minutes of writing and preparation went into each minute of his speeches. And so it would take him several hours, in fact days, to go through the drafts and prepare them. And in that process, probably the only person who really heard them over and over again would have been his secretaries who were typing them out.
Thank you. Christina in Hillsborough says, is it true that he would actually sometimes write speeches and also take meetings from the bath?
Churchill was very keen on baths, and he went into his bath twice a day, and he wasn't bothered really about getting into the bath and getting out of the bath with anybody around him. He was very, very unself-conscious about his nakedness. And there's a fantastic story about him meeting the President of the United States, where Roosevelt comes in to meet him, and he's just stepped out of the bath, and Churchill is standing there fully naked in front of President Roosevelt. And he turns to him and says, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has nothing to hide from the President of the United States. And he was like that with everybody, but he didn't sit in the bath for hours writing his speech. If he was writing a speech, they needed to have a bath and needed to carry on, get dressed. He would have continued to dictate and think out loud throughout that whole process. So in effect, it didn't matter where he was. And he did see people, he did meet people during the course of his morning routine, and it would depend where he was at that time. So it was part of it, but it's not as if he went and sat in the bath for inspiration. He just carried on wherever he was, and it didn't really matter what he was doing.
Thank you. Questions just come in here from Bob in Chicago, and he says, I'd be interested in hearing who you think were Churchill's key advisors or ministers who helped England survive the early dark days of the war.
I think one of the interesting things about Winston Churchill is that by the early years of the war, the first year of the Second World War, he was pretty much an outsider. He had allies within Parliament, and Anthony Eden was one of his closest associates, and he worked very closely with him. But one of the interesting things about what Churchill does in May 1940, and one of the reasons why I think he was chosen to be the Prime Minister, is that he forms a genuine national government. And it's very important that he brings in Clement Attlee and other members of the Labour Party. He brings in the Liberal Party, and he breaks away from this idea of it being a Conservative government to become a totally national government. And it was easier maybe for him to do that. He wasn't at that stage the party leader, but he was a prominent, very well-known politician who'd been a familiar face for decades. And I think that enabled him to create a brand new team. But it was very important for Churchill always to be the top dog. And so when he created or made himself Minister of Defence so that he could coordinate all aspects of the defence of Britain, he effectively placed himself above the three traditional service ministers. So the Secretary of State for War, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and the Secretary of State for Air. And so they would have had to be ready to work very much underneath him and take directive from him. And I think it was the tensions that arose when he tried to do similar things like that with the chiefs of staff, who were the professional heads of the armed services, that he got himself into quite a lot of trouble and the tensions arose. And so it was a very interesting dynamic. But from all of this confrontation and discussion and the vigor with which he prosecuted the war, that's where a lot of the energy came from. It was a bit like a dynamo generating electricity. He drove the war forward through this almost aggressive energy that he released through his style. And so he didn't surround himself with people who were necessarily going to support him. He liked tension and he liked confrontation because he found that energizing. And I think that was a very important part of his style. And yet at the same time, he had to be the center of attention, and the nation wanted it that way, certainly in the summer of 1940.
Very interesting, thank you. James in Galena in the United States says, Churchill had been very critical of the Chamberlain regime, but do you think he had always desired to be the leader himself?
Churchill was a very ambitious man, and right from the beginning of his parliamentary political career, you can see him pushing his way to the top of the field. And within the United Kingdom, that is Prime Minister. And so naturally, he would have had the desire right from the beginning of getting all the way to the top. But because of the nature of his personality and the many challenges and hiccups that he overcame along the way, he had to wait until effectively the nation came to him. And I think that was a very important part of what brought him to the fore. So he was ready, and in a way his personality was the only one that suited that particular moment. So it's one of those very rare instances where the need of the nation and the personality of the solution coalesce and create something that enables history to move forward in the right direction.
Thank you. Linda in the United States asks, was there a certain percentage of people who didn't trust Churchill and still blamed him for Gallipoli?
Oh, very much so. I mean, it's not just Gallipoli. I mean, Churchill brought with him a lot of baggage. He had he'd been a member of parliament since the early 1900s. So by 1940, he'd been in and out of parliament for the best part of 40 years. He had been Home Secretary when he was seen to be very harsh on the suffragettes. He'd been seen by the working class as a strikebreaker in the South Wales coalfields before the First World War. He'd been instrumental in confronting the trade unions during the general strike. And so many people across the United Kingdom were mistrustful of Churchill and also saw him as an out-of-touch, aloof aristocrat. And so this is why it's only when the circumstances demand somebody with his pugnacity, somebody with his determination, somebody with his unshakable resolve, that the vast majority of the nation were prepared to suspend their suspicions, set them to one side, and embrace him as the only person with the energy and the focus and the insight to enable the nation to go forward in the way it needed to. But it was a very close run thing. And again, I think it's only because there were no other real options in May 1940. The Labour Party certainly didn't want Lord Halifax. Neville Chamberlain was time expired. And so of politicians of stature, Churchill was almost the only one left. And it required a great deal of willingness to set aside the enmities, the suspicions, the distrust of the past and embrace him as a true national leader.
Thank you. John in Palm City in the United States asks, can you tell us more about how Churchill managed to convince the USA to support Britain in the war?
Churchill knew right from the very beginning that he could probably stop the nation in 1940. He could stop Hitler's expansion. He could kind of shore up the resolve and make people believe that this was possible. But he was also very conscious that Britain on its own would not be able to produce the resources, the manpower, the scale needed to defeat Nazi Germany over the course of the war. And so right from the beginning of his premiership, he began wooing President Roosevelt. He began trying to bring the United States step by step into an alignment. And he had to do this through a series of diplomatic steps, but also, as with the people of the United Kingdom themselves, he had to do it through a demonstration of his personality. And it was tremendously important when Britain attacked and sank a large part of the French fleet at Iran in July 1940. This was a key moment because Churchill was seen as the architect of that, and it was a demonstration of Britain's resolve. And that was very important in persuading President Roosevelt that Britain was a nation that was not going to surrender. They were not going to give in. Churchill then had to work very hard to try and work within what he recognized as the political constraints that the president was operating under through the Neutrality Act. And so they had to find very clever diplomatic ways in which the president could support the prime minister, but at the same time not politically distance himself from the American electorate. This was made slightly easier after Roosevelt's re-election at the end of 1940, because he no longer had to worry about that, and it was becoming an increasingly dire situation. So it's a very slow process, and I personally think this is probably one of Churchill's greatest achievements during the war, is laying the groundwork, certainly from the outbreak of war or from his accession to the premiership through to the Atlantic Charter in August 1941, where Roosevelt very skillfully brings Churchill, the arch-imperialist, into a declaration of everybody's right to self-determination, which is not what you would have expected. That is the moment where I think the two nations morally begin to align much more closely. So the step from there to war at the end of the year is much less great than it would have been if Churchill hadn't undertaken a year of very assiduous diplomacy.
Thank you. Kerry in Charlotte asks, do you think Churchill's speeches would have had the same impact on the British public without them being recorded and broadcast?
Well, they only really started to become broadcast from the midsummer. So the first couple of those ones which we featured in the video in May and early June weren't actually broadcast at the time. It only begins really with that speech on the 18th of June, where he couldn't record it in the House of Commons. They couldn't do it live. The Parliament wouldn't allow it. So he went off to the BBC and recorded it. And I think from that moment on, what that did is it opened out Churchill's access to the people, because, as I've already said, he worked extremely hard to craft these speeches and to build into them literary techniques and historical references and idiom of English language, which are what makes them so powerful still today. And in a way, if you read it in a newspaper, some of that sound of his voice, some of the delivery is all lost. And so once he could record them and they could be relayed directly to the people, that became much more effective. And there are two or three of the key speeches which were broadcast direct from the Churchill War Rooms, the Cabinet War Rooms as it then was, including one on what Americans would call 9/11, the 11th of September in 1940, as the Blitz stepped up a pace. But also he broadcast from the Churchill War Rooms to the United States on the 8th of December 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. So he reached out to the United States in the same way to announce and embrace the close relationship between the two nations that was coming. And I think that was made possible through the popular medium of radio.
Thank you, Nigel. You just mentioned Pearl Harbor. So Greg in Chicago asks, would you say that December the 7th, 1941 was a good or a bad day for Churchill?
He thought it was a brilliant day. He heard the news and he breathed a sigh of relief and basically said, at that moment, I knew we had won the war, because he was absolutely convinced that with the might, the industrial might and the manpower of the United States on the side of the United Kingdom and the dispossessed people of Europe and the people of the British Empire, that this would in time become an unstoppable force, and that the features of global fascism and ultranationalism would step by step be overcome. And so in a way, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, followed very quickly by Hitler's rather eccentric declaration of war on the United States, brought the US into the fold in exactly the way that Churchill wanted, because it put the two nations side by side. And over the course of the rest of the war, the balance between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union changes and shifts year by year by year. But that moment of entry into the war of the United States really is the point at which Britain knows that its side will ultimately be the victor. And what then goes on to happen is that a policy of strategic sharing, coordination, working very closely together becomes the dominant characteristic of the Allied forces, in extreme contrast to the Axis, who never coordinate and never bring themselves to work together, and they don't bring their plans or share their resources. And that ultimately, I believe, is the factor that means the Allied side wins the war and the Axis loses, simply through strategic coordination and the sharing of resources. And until the United States is a part of that equation, it will be impossible for the United Kingdom, and even the United Kingdom and the USSR, to win the war on its own. And it's only when those three big nations are able to come together and bring with them many other nations into what become the United Nations, that the war has a course which then needs to be followed step by step until ultimately it's resolved.
Thank you. Question here from Joe in Jacksonville, in the United States, and he says, what was Churchill's relationship with the British royal family like when he was initially appointed as Prime Minister?
There was Churchill was relatively unknown with King George VI because in one of those strange moments of archetypal Churchillian loyalty, he had sided with the Prince of Wales, King Edward VIII, during the abdication crisis. And although I don't think this had caused the king, who was Edward VIII's brother and who succeeded by default to the throne, I don't think it offended him. Nevertheless, it rather distanced him from the royal family. But the relationship between the two men grew up very quickly. And I think it was one very soon established on mutual respect and a recognition of each other's characteristic. They were totally different people. And yet at the same time, in a way, they were complementary in that the king was a gentleman who worked hard to overcome some of his difficulties and was able to engage with the people almost through being a normal person. And yet Churchill was this ebullient, charismatic figure whose main characteristic was the power of his personality, the attraction that he laid for people through his charisma. And he could magnetize people in that way. And when they worked together, they became a very powerful force. And Churchill was a very conservative, proud British man who deferred to the royal family. And he recognized his place next to the sovereign and was very proud to do that. So I think that's an important part of how he worked. And he would have seen the king as the king of the whole of the British Empire, bringing all the peoples from around the world. And again, to Churchill, that was a very important thing. So the warm relationship between Churchill and the royal family didn't begin from a rocky start. I think it came from a distance, simply because they hadn't known each other, because Churchill had known his brother and they'd therefore been in different areas. But it grew very quickly and became a very powerful link between the two men.
Thank you, Nigel. James in Las Vegas asks, did Churchill write the Iron Curtain speech, and did he have an identifiable vision for the Iron Curtain?
Churchill had a long standing dislike of communism, Bolshevism. He'd been very keen to oppose this in the aftermath of the First World War. He'd been vocal in his skepticism of the way in which the Soviet Union had evolved in the 1930s. But when Hitler turned on the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa, immediately Churchill suspended all of this dislike and recognized that my enemy's enemy is my friend, and began to support Stalin and support the Soviet people. And Clementine Churchill also built up a very strong relationship between ordinary British people and ordinary Soviet citizens. But as the war was drawing to the close, Churchill, I think, was much more aware of the threat that Stalin, as an individual, the leader of this powerful nation, and somebody who was aggressive and barbaric, Churchill was perhaps more aware of the threat that he posed, certainly to European stability, than President Roosevelt. And possibly this came from Churchill's years of experience. Maybe it came from this latent distrust of Bolshevism. But for whatever reason, Churchill began to recognize before the end of the war that this could be a problem. And that was why I think he was much keener to push the British forces closer to Berlin, to make sure that Stalin had less of an opportunity to dominate and effectively annex Eastern Europe. And so when he wrote his speech, he was really trying to alert the world to what he thought had already come to pass in the immediate aftermath of the war. And it wasn't a popular speech. It wasn't anything that people necessarily expected. He hadn't cleared this with many other people. So it came as a bit of a shock. And yet at the same time, retrospectively, as with Churchill in the 1930s, warning against the threat of Hitler, we can see that he was sounding a very clear clarion call to the danger that the Soviet Union would pose to the West for the next 20 years. And so it's sometimes difficult to assess what impact it had, but it certainly made the West much more aware of the fact that this would be the new area of confrontation.
Thank you. John in Largo says, can you tell us what type of things are inside the Churchill War Rooms and what you can see when you visit there?
Churchill War Rooms is a really interesting place to visit because it's one of those rare places that is genuinely a time capsule. At the end of the war, so on the 16th of August 1945, the day after the Japanese surrender, the last element of the Cabinet War Room, which was the map room, which had operated throughout the war 24/7, it was closed down, the door was locked, and basically the rest of the area was suspended. Gradually over the next 2 or 3 years, the offices were empty and run down. But by the end of 1947, people began to realize that this was a place where tremendous things had happened. And so they made sure that four of the key rooms, so the cabinet room, Churchill's own bedroom, the map room, and the transatlantic telephone call room, where Churchill had been able to speak to President Roosevelt on a direct scrambled telephone. These were all preserved exactly as they'd been left. And so they became available for people to come and visit, but it wasn't a public venue. And it was only in the 1980s that it was opened up through the Imperial War Museum as a place for people to come and visit. So effectively, what you see in places like the map room and the cabinet room is what was left. All that the Imperial War Museum did was open it up, create a visitor route, and interpret it for people to understand. And so it really is one of these deeply evocative places that you can go and get an immediate sense of the past. You can feel what went on within the cabinet room, where they sat and deliberated these enormous events. You can feel within the map room this vast kind of intellectual brain where intelligence and news and information was processed in the same way that we get our digital news today. In the telephone room, you can actually see where Churchill would have sat for the first time using a secure line, using American technology through the Bell Telephone Company. This would have enabled Roosevelt and Churchill to speak in safety for the first time. These are the very places where they sat, and it's the equipment that you're looking at. And so if you have a sense of history, the Churchill War Rooms is a very powerful place to go because you can connect with that sense of history immediately. And what Imperial War Museum has done since the mid-2000s is extend the site so that you can also get a sense of Churchill's own life within the Churchill Museum. And so for people looking at Britain and the United States and the history of the Second World War, this is the place to visit because you can plug in almost literally to a sense of the past and to a sense of the events that took place there and know that you are in the place on the spot where these very things happen. And I think that's what makes it such a satisfactory visit, is that you go away full of a sense of having touched the history of the nation.
Thank you, Nigel. Harold in Cambridge says, I've read that 2 new galleries have recently opened at the Imperial War Museum. Can you tell us a bit about these and what sort of stories visitors can expect to learn about?
Yes, we're very pleased that at our Lambeth Road branch, we've just opened a couple of weeks ago a brand new Second World War gallery and a brand new Holocaust gallery. And these have deliberately been developed together in a united team in order to make sure that the events of the Holocaust are told fully within the context of the Second World War. And what we've been working towards is to create a modern 21st century account of both events. because since we last told these stories, which was about 20, 25 years ago, so much research has been done, so much more information has come to light about the history of these events that we wanted to update them and bring all of the new techniques that we have, the design elements, to make sure that these are the most powerful and moving experiences that we can offer to people within the context of a museum. And so if visitors come and look at these new galleries, along with the relatively new First World War galleries, which were opened in 2014, you will find the full power of museums to carry and tell a powerful narrative. And so we use large objects, we use small objects, we use faces, we use individual stories to bring alive these events and present them in a way that visitors hopefully will be able to work their way through and come away with a new understanding of what these events mean within the 21st century. And particularly important for the Second World War is the narrative that I worked upon and led the team that built up the storyline, is that we wanted to place the experience of the Second World War for the United Kingdom within a much broader global context. Previous iterations as a national museum in the UK had focused on the British experience, but we felt it was very important for visitors in the 21st century to see the bigger international picture. And so we have created a bigger proportion of the narrative and devoted a bigger proportion of the narrative to telling the story of the war against Japan across the Pacific and the war on the Eastern Front. And so that helps to contextualize those areas where the Allies came together to defeat global fascism. And we hope that visitors from across the world will be able to come and understand that story much more clearly than the old iteration. And we're very proud that we are the first museum outside the United States who has been given a piece of the USS Arizona from Pearl Harbor to display as part of that bit of the display. And we very proudly put that into the beginning of the story of the vast war against Japan. And hopefully we'll be able to use this to make British visitors understand the nature of Pearl Harbor more closely, and to make American visitors who already understand that see how that fits within the wider British story.
Thank you very much, Nigel. We've got a personal question here from Darren in Kent, who asks, when did you first become interested in Churchill in this period of history?
Well, I've been working throughout the museum's terms of reference, so that's from really 1900 onwards, all my professional life. So I've been doing that for about 35 years now. Now, I first came across Churchill not within the context of the Second World War, but within the context of the First World War, because my original research work was into the Dardanelles, into Gallipoli. And I went to Gallipoli a lot, and I told the story of Gallipoli to people on the ground and through books. And so Churchill is a very powerful figure within that narrative. And so it interested me how he related to that and what degree of responsibility he had. And I think you have to separate out the Dardanelles, the naval operation, from the Gallipoli attack. And it's very important to distance him from the way in which the land campaign went so badly. But what then also interested me is the way in which, at the end of that campaign, as it became clear that it had not succeeded and had reached a stalemate similar to the Western Front, Churchill resigned and went to the Western Front. And the story of Winston Churchill as a battalion commander on the Western Front is an extremely interesting one, because here you see almost the same qualities that you see in Churchill as Prime Minister in 1940. At the beginning of January 1916, when he's given command of the 6th Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers, a kind of smashed up battalion, very low morale, and he picks them up, and through the sheer strength of his personality, he reinvigorates them, rebuilds them, and turns them back into a proud fighting unit in a very similar way to the way he turns the whole of the nation around in the summer of 1940. And so Churchill has been a character that I've studied through those periods, as well as having now picked up Churchill within the context of the Churchill War Rooms, as we look again at how we tell that story within the 21st century. People tend to think that museums are static, that we have a series of showcases and that we put objects in it and we just leave them there. But it's very important that we're constantly assessing and analysing what our stories mean and how they relate to visitors as they age and they move through and they come from different experiences. And so we're constantly looking at our stories and our collections and how we use them to engage people with what really matters. And so the Churchill War Rooms, HMS Belfast, Imperial War Museum Duxford, they're all exactly the same. We're constantly looking to make sure that the stories we tell are as powerful as they can possibly be. And Winston Churchill, whenever you look at the two world wars, is a key part of those stories. And it's fascinating to me that he lived such a long life over such a long professional period of time, over 50 years. And throughout that time, the world completely changes. And yet Churchill stays there at the heart of this political nation, dominating and taking a role. And it's a fascinating story. And I hope that we will get the opportunity to make sure that that is updated over the next few years and kept up to date at the Churchill War Rooms.
Thank you so much, Nigel. Just one final question to end on for tonight. Fiona in London, she says, can you recommend any good books for further reading about Churchill's life?
There are many books, and it really depends what avenue you want to pursue, really. If you're looking for an introductory biography, there is a very good single brief life by Dr. Piers Brendan, who used to be the director of the Churchill Archives Centre at Churchill College in Cambridge. And that, I have found, is the best place to start. Beyond that, you have to be very careful because people normally come at Churchill with an agenda. But recently, I've also been reading The Style of Winston Churchill, or Churchill's Style, by Barry Singer. And that is a great book because it's an easy to read book, but it talks about Churchill's lifestyle. It talks about Churchill's cigar. It talks about the clothes that he wears. It talks about that within the context of this very interesting and colourful life. And what I like about the book is it's quite light. So it's not a biography, but it gives you an insight into the many facets of this fascinating man. And even though, like Sir Alan Brooke, who was chief of the Imperial General Staff and the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee in the UK, although at times Churchill can be deeply frustrating simply because of the levels of energy that he exudes, nevertheless, you keep coming back to what a remarkable man he was and what a powerful character, and how lucky Britain was as a nation that he should be there waiting in the wings for the call to come and lead the nation forward.